So it is 9 o'clock, so I would like to welcome you all and say thank you for joining us so early in the morning. We can go out and go do shopping, and Ralph can go back to bed. He hasn't been to bed. He's had a very long day. Ralph, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us. We are very interested in what you've got to say and to tell us. And then Ralph also said he will do his own introduction to tell us a bit more about how he got interested and what he's planning to do and what he's done so far. Thank you, Ralph. Over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Ralph McLean. I'm the project director of the South Africa War Graves Project. Uh, I typically get the same questions all the time, so I'll give a brief overview of how the project started and where we're going and how I got involved all these years ago, and then we'll open it up to questions. So back in 1997 or 8, I got involved as a volunteer photographer with the Maple Leaf Legacy Project. That is the Canadian version of all the war grave projects. Shortly thereafter, an Australian version of the Commonwealth War Graves Project started up. And right before I took off traveling, there was a British version that took off. And I was sharing photos primarily from Canada at that point. But I left my job and I decided to move traveling around the world. Very well, I've been traveling for a year. After I came back from some of my travels, a big part of my world travels was visiting war cemeteries. I've always been interested in cemeteries when I was a child, and I was a military historian, so this was just a good fit for me. And I realized I had in my collection of all these thousands and thousands and thousands of photos that I've been collecting for the Canadians, the Australians. It was actually a New Zealand project, actually. The British hadn't formed yet. When I came back to Canada, I had over 3,000 South African war graves. So that's how I started. I had zero connection to going back. I have no connection to South Africa whatsoever. But I asked the other war grave project coordinators or what they were doing with South African war grave photos, and nobody had an answer. Well, I'll start it up and I'll collect it up and I'll organize this simply because of the fact that someone from South Africa at some point might want this information, and that's how the South Africa War Graves Project started. And it collected a few volunteers along the way. And those volunteers early in the project's history were telling me, well, we have to do the Rhodesians as well. Okay. And so that's why it's not called the South African War Graves Project. It's called the South Africa War Graves Project. And because we collect not only just headstone photos of South African soldiers, we collect in the Rhodesians and Zimbabweans and whatnot. So we actually get a lot of extra war graves that would otherwise not be collected up by another war graves project that was intending to commemorate these men and women. And so we went from there. But whereas other projects, their scope might go from, let's say, the Boer War, World War I, World War II, Korea. We kind of go to from our main focus is Boer War to present day. But if it's a military grave or police grave, it's got any sort of connection to South Africa or the Southern African countries, we collect them because we rather have the photo in archive and looking at it, not needing it, versus needing it, not having it. So I thought the project was going to be easy, but because we just download the data from World War I and World War II from the Commonwealth War Graves project, but adding in all this additional data. I've been typing at the keyboard for 15 years. So The database has something unique, like 48,000 unique records. And so those records also needed to be corrected. We sent in 3,000 plus corrections just on data correction alone to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to update their records to make them more complete. We found a lot of errors. I mean, thousands of errors just in World War One records. And some of those World War One records were transcribed in error on headstones incorrectly. So that's been a big part of my last 15 years, just making sure the correct data is there. We've started into the World War II records, making sure we have all full names, dates of birth, correcting family information, correcting just simple spelling and a lot of errors. The problem is when they originally started off with doing data collection, they took what the military gave them, and when they sent out the next of kin forms to the next of kin, a lot of times it either didn't get returned or it went to a different address and the family moved on, or maybe there was no next of kin. Sometimes these records were transcribed incorrectly from the military. So it's a giant jigsaw puzzle piece that you don't know what the jigsaw puzzle looks like, but we've got a fairly good handle on it. So not only are we doing data correction and data collection, we're also looking for war grave photos. And the biggest areas, we've got all of Europe done. Had all of Europe done for years. The biggest areas that we don't have are countries of Libya. Understandably, we're not going to request anybody go to Libya on purpose. It's still high tension in that country. Algeria, we don't have very much from. And then South Africa, believe it or not. There's big chunks of South Africa that haven't been tackled. Northwest Province, Eastern Cape, a lot of farm cemeteries. It's really scattered. Like Western Cape was pretty well covered years ago, but the remainder of the provinces, states are really scattered, fill in the blank places here and there. And this is where we work with eGGSA and Rihanna, Alta, and all the fantastic volunteers out there. Is we get these photos, 1 or 2 or 10 at a time, on a sharing basis. We offer our photos 100% for free to anybody that requests them. We don't charge. There's absolutely no charge. So, 5 to 10 requests a week, typically around Remembrance Week in November. It can be as high as 50 a week. I don't remember in the last 15 years. So I was actually filling out requests here earlier on tonight via email just to stay awake. So, it's an everyday job, and I love doing it. And but that's, other than once falling in love with a South African woman in my province, I have no connection to South Africa, but I'm interested in the history. It's a very, very, very interesting military history, and it's not well known. Campaigns that South Africans and Norwegians fought in are not campaigns that most people associate with World War I and World War II. And it's been a pleasure actually also updating the border war records. We add new records all the time. The project coordinator, national coordinator in South Africa, and it's Terry Kaywood. He's out of Victoria. He's constantly updating the main database, and also does a lot of research down at Alta as well. Honest to God, if you didn't have Terry Kaywood, you wouldn't have. So, a lot of the extra work and research that you see on our records is due to Terry Kaywood's hard work. We operate came to South Africa years ago. Stayed in this place for a couple of weeks. I'm not great. Just, you know, and getting most of them. So I'm just going to, rather than keep on rattling on here, maybe people have any questions about the project, what we do, or how we can help. I'm glad to answer those questions.
Good morning, or good night, I don't know what it is for you. Did you have great difficulty dealing with South African names?
I've been in 55 countries, so I'm used to, I've gotten used to spellings of different things and the accents and how names sound. When I first started off, we had one volunteer. His name was Ricky. I guess you pronounce it Nokia or Nortje. And before I talked to him on the phone, I thought it was Murchie. So that's what it looked like. But you got to learn how to the different spellings and the names with South African names, and it comes with time. One of the things I've learned actually though is I've actually been quite expert on African names and like regional African names, and I could actually spot out like mistakes like 1,000 paces out. Oh, that name's spelled incorrectly, and so that's actually helped within our research because I can spot those errors, and we've corrected those errors. And we've actually done quite a few error corrections in terms of African names. There are misspellings for the Commonwealth War Graves on Commonwealth War Grave headstones and also memorials. We corrected the Brookwood 1914-1918 memorial years ago, but those corrections, there's about 10 corrections still in those corrections that still need to be amended. So what we do with the Commonwealth War Graves is we don't assume that somebody else is doing the work. We do the research. We forward all that information to the Commonwealth War Graves, and it just goes into one lineup. We try not to overbuild them, like we might send them 5 or 10 a week. That's slowed down considerably, but for a good 5 years, it was 50 minutes a week we were submitting for error corrections with proof. You can't just say, well, this is wrong. You actually have to supply the proof that it's wrong, and then so we're doing that. But I'll tell you the one thing I have, it's still a mystery to me in terms of South African names is Van Buren. And I see Jans Van Buren, and I see Janssen Van Buren, and I don't know what's correct, or if all three are correct, or what, because you'll see a lot of names where as part of their first names or middle names, like the name might be Jans or Janssen, and then the last name is Van Buren. So again, I don't know if the last name is supposed to be Jans Van Buren, Janssen Van Buren, or Van Buren. And I know there's a reasoning behind that name, like the origin names. I can't remember what it is, but it's like son of or something like that of Buren, and so that's the number one name issue I have amongst Afrikaans names, is trying to find out if the name is, the last name is the full last name. Because we want to reflect those in our records, but also make sure those records are being transmitted to the Commonwealth War Graves, so that if there's a headstone correction, that they're not wasting money engraving a new headstone for somebody down the road when the last name should be Jansander or Jansenga. So we do a lot of research to make sure we're making do it right. Because I'm cheap. Like, I don't want to spend money on headstones. I know how much the headstones cost. I do a lot of work here in Canada with the Last Post Fund, an organization that marks unmarked veterans' graves. And having the stake on a headstone is permanent. And so if the Commonwealth War Graves gets around to reinstalling a headstone, it might be 50 years down the road so that the connection's made. like to make sure we're doing a lot of research and submitting correct news. It's a great question, and I'm thanking you for bringing it up because it is my biggest issue in that Van Buren block of names, making sure it's right.
Yes, Ralph, may I just ask a question? If somebody was wounded during the war and they only died of the wounds, say 2 or 3 years after the end of the war,
Yeah.
What is your cutoff?
So it's not my cutoff, it's the cutoff for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So during World War I, the cutoff is August 31st, 1921. And at that point, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the military considered anything after that as a non-service related death. They could have died of wounds in 1924, but it wasn't something they were going to maintain that grade in perpetuity. And different countries have different rules. So here in Canada, if you're veteran death after the war, the grade is maintained if you or grade extent. So they have that place here. Same thing with Australia. New Zealand's kind of coming on board. Britain, really, it's just a hodgepodge. But for World War II, that cutoff date is December 31st, 1947. And there's lots of cases where I found somebody that died September 1st, 1921, and it's not a war grave. It's a military grave. And in cases where we can have a case here locally. The man died January 1st, 1948. He was a prisoner of war in Hong Kong, but one day or more than would allow him to be considered a Commonwealth war grave, but he did die of as a result of his time spent in a prisoner of war camp in Japan. So it's tragic, but they look at it as like every veteran, every soldier will die, so they have to have distinct cutoffs because otherwise it's not worth it. So.
Okay. Could I ask you just one last question?
Sure, yeah.
If, I know that you are still looking for a lot of graves. Where can people find a list of graves that are still outstanding for South Africa?
So we used to rely quite a bit on the website. The website, the front page was, we used to have all these lists on there. It actually became quite troublesome to keep up and maintain those spreadsheets on there. So I tell people now, just search the database. If you could type in your home town name, let's say it's South Africa. If you want to find out who's buried locally, you can do a search on those cemeteries. But my biggest suggestion is, because I don't like overwhelm volunteers, and I don't want somebody to travel around 500 kilometers on this big whirlwind trip finding headstones to photograph, and they've taken it in the wrong format. We have a very specific format that we need the headstones to be taken in. So I typically encourage people to contact me so that I can send them sample headstone photos that will be like. But also we give them maps and lists, and we encourage people to start locally and then start circling around their area if they want to do stuff. But if you're doing a beeline for, looking at your master cemetery photography, and you know what you're doing. But the problem in South Africa and South Africa Commonwealth War Graves Commission is a lot of these farm cemeteries. It's when we find them, they didn't have GPS back then. It might have been Brown's Farm Cemetery, mile 218 or something, and it's called something completely different. Thankfully, you guys GPS your cemetery locations, and there was one I think that Rihanna sent me recently, actually, of a single war grave from World War I and he was buried next to his wife. And the entire cemetery was just covered in brambles. And these two grainy photos that one of the volunteers sent in, I was actually able to send it into the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission. Said, listen, here's the GPS, this grave needs attention. Yeah, we're on it. We'll put it on our schedule minutes. So Commonwealth Wargraves Commission actually depends on the eGGSA and South Africa Wargraves Project to help us maintain the graves. So I can't stress this enough. Never assume somebody knows what the condition of the cemetery is or the headstone is. If it's in bad condition, let us know immediately. We send in a correctional report for maintenance that same week, and I typically get a response back within 12 to 24 hours from Marie from the South African agency. And says, yeah, we'll next inspection schedule we'll maintain this. And they go in, and clean up the headstone, they clean up the burial location, they cut down trees. Sometimes they even erect fences. So there's a resource there, but if you don't use that tool that's in your toolbox, then you're not going to assume that things need to be done. There's a lot of missing graves out there, especially on farm cemeteries. They just don't know where they are. They have basic understanding, maybe where they are, but if you go out to the cemetery and realize that you might just stumble on a farm cemetery that's never been recorded before. So, sorry.
Yeah. I know which one you're talking about, the one I sent you. I think it was in the Eastern Cape.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think for just the sake of the other participants, it was one of our volunteers, Nadine van der Merwe, stumbled across.
Yeah, Nadine, yeah.
Yeah. She stumbled across this grave in the middle of a bush, and it was, like you say, just a single grave.
Yeah.
But she could hardly photograph it. She couldn't get close enough to it. It was so overgrown. So it was very important. You know, it's like you say, you don't walk past a war grave. Rather just take a photo. And also for the others, if I receive any commemoration stones, I also send it to Ralph. I then ask the photographer permission. Can I give it to Ralph? They always say yes. And you add it to your website. That would be a stone, for instance, say in King Williamstown, where the parents were buried, but they mentioned the son who died in Italy. And that you also add to your website. It also helps you because you can see, or maybe just double check that you've got the parents correctly, or the brothers or sisters, whoever whoever's name is on the headstone as well. So you and I work together quite a lot. You give me a lot and I give you a lot.
There's a hat trick to everyone. A friend near George has some British Tommy graves on his property. They are Scottish soldiers buried in Plettenberg Bay. Some cameras will record a GPS location. So this is common for Boer War era graves. I think the South African agency is paid by the British Ministry of Defence to maintain Boer War graves now. But if they don't know where they are, they can't maintain it. If you stumble upon Boer War era graves, whether it's in a cemetery or on the belt or in somebody's backyard, you really need to let us know where they are. Because if they're, especially if they're bad condition, the Commonwealth Wargraves Commission South Africa agency gets paid to actually go out there and maintain that cemetery and those headstones. So it benefits them. It's paid by the British. So if Patrick, you can tell your friend near George that if he's got these graves on his property, by all means let us know. And we'll make mention to the South African agency to